Trees in every country. Trees, you know we can work together and learn what we need to meet the challenge.
Hello, and welcome to the ISA Rewind video series. I'm Tabitha Schwartz, Credentialing Partner and Operations Manager at the International Society of Arboriculture. Today, ISA is proud to bring you a presentation by Alexander Martin and Lara Roman on the social political drivers of urban tree diversity and composition. This presentation was originally given at the 2023 ISA Virtual Conference, so the views seen here are those of the presenters. If you're interested in the history of urban forest development and would like to know how your region can build an urban forest, I expect you would like this presentation. Now sit back and enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation for the ISA virtual event for the 2023 conference, Socio-political Drivers of Urban Tree Diversity and Composition, Development, Symbolism, and Stratification. Our presentation talks about two different areas, and so we are two different presenters. Myself, Alexander Martin, board-certified master arborist at the ISA, the director of Ironwood Urban Forestry Consulting Incorporated, research and consulting company located in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I'm also a master's student at the University of Toronto. I'm joined by Lara Roman, PhD, research ecologist at the United States Forest Service. My presentation touches on building an urban forest, from dust to ashes in Winnipeg, Canada. Lara's is the history of London planetree in Philadelphia, United States. So building an urban forest, from dust to ashes in Winnipeg, Canada. So Winnipeg is located in the center of Canada, in the province of Manitoba. It's the capital city of Manitoba, just north of the US-Canada border. It's located on Treaty 1 territory, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And so as much as Winnipeg, we're talking about the history of Winnipeg as a city, the history of the land itself dates back far longer and has been used as a gathering point for generations. Winnipeg as a city began to develop around the fur trade with the Hudson's Bay Company and the voyageurs across Canada, traveling in search of pelts that could be made into clothing. So these were large canoes that traveled down the rivers of Canada and portaged great lengths to access points where there was sufficient fur, for example, beaver pelts for hats, largely that were exported back to Europe or into the booming economy of Ontario, Quebec, and East. And so these pelts, first off, need a place to be stored and to be treated and dried. And so that came from the forts that were constructed, the stopping points for the voyageur and the Hudson's Bay Company. And as much as these were places to store and prep pelts, they were also places of business. So commercial trade and economic activities were conducted at these forts to sell pelts in exchange for hunting ammunition, for alcohol, for tobacco. And that's the history of Winnipeg especially. So Winnipeg had, former to the city itself was Fort Garry. And so Fort Garry was established by the Hudson's Bay Company. And it was a fort that served as both a place of residence, but also a place of business, of economic venture in the early history of Canada. So this is a photo from 1860. You can see the characteristic Red River carts, and most notably, a lack of trees, the prairie landscape that comprised Winnipeg. And so as these forts continued to grow, as more people moved into the area, it grew outwards past the walls of the original establishment. So we start to see people moving in. Those big walls that characterize the fort are lost the backdrop of an expanding, soon-to-be city. And again, no trees, flat prairie, the traditional ecological landscape of the city of Winnipeg. And so these areas emerged over time. The trees were planted into these new landscapes. They're largely brought up from the riverbanks, like what we're seeing here. And so the city was shaped. So from empty, snowy landscape to a constructed, more urban current context as we move through the history. So again, dust, prairie landscape, no trees, and the introduction of street trees in a place that they didn't used to be. And so these streets were lined predominantly with one specific genus of tree, the elm, most specifically the American elm. And they were sourced from the riverbanks and pulled up to line these streets. Because American elm are a hardy cultivar or a hardy species, they were well suited for this early establishing city, the city that was going from a prairie landscape into a very urban, novel ecosystem. The trees that lined these streets on an individual street level, but also at the level of the city, were largely monoculture based. They were planted by community groups that were early into the history of the city. They're pulled up, planted to try and resemble the European idealism of what a city should look like. So it's based largely on literature and landscape planning and land use kind of ideals and values that came out of the Europe mindset, if you will. So a very Western approach to building a city and also greening a city, because there's no greening, there's no trees previously, but it was meant to resemble what folks would have experienced in Europe, but also experienced in places like Ontario and around Toronto. And as the city grew, these trees were protected by groups with socio-political interests, community groups that were outspoken in support of these treed landscapes. And so this is a great example here. These were the women of the community of Wolseley in Winnipeg, a small neighborhood. And the city had an interest in removing elm trees, most notably the Wolseley elm, which you see here with between the two women with the Keep Right sign. And the function of that removal was to increase the flow of traffic, improve kind of the gray infrastructure of the city, the transit routes, the drivability of the city. And so those groups essentially operate in a way to protect certain areas of elm populations in largely residential neighborhoods and in largely wealthy neighborhoods as well, because these groups had to have the source of funds and also the notoriety or power to protect those trees from removal. And that's often looked at as a benefit, and it's looked at in isolation. So they're saying, well, the community group prevented these trees from being removed at this point in time in history, which is true, but in that specific area. So what the city did, as is true, and you'll see across multiple cities and multiple states and provinces, multiple countries, is the resistance of one socio-political group in one area results in the planned removal of trees being diverted to another area for new infrastructure projects, for alternative land use planning. So instead of ceasing that project to exist, it's instead exported elsewhere to a different section of the city or to a different city entirely. And so interestingly, as the city develops, you can see the switch in the planting palettes that largely came about from Dutch elm disease and emerald ash borer arriving in North America. So here you can see a geo-referenced map of the history of Winnipeg in terms of its growth patterns. So up until 1872, very small, the fort, Lower Fort Garry. And then the outward expansion, 1872 to 1900, you start to see the city moving outwards. 1900 to 1925, 1925 to 1950. And that was the shell where we have Dutch elm disease arrive in North America. It becomes a concern for urban foresters. Just south of the border, Frank Coffert, forester, the University of Minnesota, started publishing and talking about how is the Midwest going to be impacted by Dutch elm disease with its monoculture forests. So that biodiversity, the planting palettes start to become more biodiverse. We see that in little tiny rings just outside of the elm. But not all trees grow everywhere. There's 26 native tree species in Manitoba. Not all of them are suited for boulevard tree planting, for street tree planting. Ash does remarkably well. And so the planting palette gets narrowed down again to ash. And ash was doing quite well until emerald ash borer showed up in the 1990s. And then we see the diversification of the palette again as this ring donut after the 1990s, as the city continues to expand outwards in the absence of urban growth boundaries. The result is these clusters of ash populations and elm populations. The elm are largely central around the original areas of the city, whereas the ash are kind of on that periphery, that second ring, before we hit the third ring of biodiverse planting in the new suburban developments that we see on the outside of the city of Winnipeg. And this has effects on the populations that live there. So if you have a street that's entirely lined with elm tree, like you see in this photo, a few years later, they all disappear to Dutch elm disease, and the city street is left barren of trees. The neighborhood itself is left barren of trees, which as a consequence brings about these new public health issues, like increased cardiovascular complications, lower respiratory tract infections, standard of living that drops down, the happiness of the people in those neighborhoods drops, whether it's with Dutch elm disease or with emerald ash borer, although with emerald ash borer has been the predominant focus of those studies. So this results in an issue of inequality. And so we can look at that inequality using the Gini index and Lorenz curves. So this red dotted line we see in the middle is perfect equality, where in this case, the basal area per hectare is perfectly distributed across the proportion of the population living in the city of Winnipeg. The blue line is the existing inequality, so what we have right now. We can simulate the loss of all the elm trees over the years, and we see that with the loss of elm, we actually have a more equal distribution of the urban forest, which isn't to say that Dutch elm disease is good for distributional inequalities. It just presents how the city is morphed around the elm trees. And the elms are quite large, obviously, so that's why we see that basal area decreasing, becoming more equitable. On the other side of things, ash trees are largely placed in areas of difficult growing conditions where elm couldn't be planted because of Dutch elm disease, but also is the early segments of the city where, if we look at the distribution of trees, the closer we get to no trees in an area, we kind of see this overlap where the ash start to give way to nothing. But the biodiversity is up over here in the higher canopy cover areas. So as a result, after emerald ash borer, the inequalities get worse. And that's a trend. This image is for Winnipeg, but this is a trend seen across Canada, especially the Canadian prairies and the Midwest of the United States. The large reason for that was because of how the city's developed. And so we can plot these curves, but our conclusion shouldn't be simply urban foresters aren't planting equitably or aren't planting in very good areas, because often the issue is a lack of planting space or the urban policies that influenced the development of the city outwards, but also internally. So in this case, this is a photo of the north end of Winnipeg, which is the more impoverished area of Winnipeg. And it was separated from the rest of Winnipeg, southern Winnipeg and central Winnipeg, by the rail yards. And so for years, the city services never crossed those rail yards into the north end. So tree planting was minimal, city transit services were minimal, and it was a heavily industrial area. There's very little planting space, and as a result, you get this ash like you see in this picture here, where it's struggling to survive in the condition that has been planted within. Because you're living in a very difficult, as a tree, you're living in a very difficult area with a lot of impervious surface, a lot of toxins, that they're forcing the species planting list to be narrow and narrow and narrow until you only have a few species left. In this case, ash, because Dutch elm disease is a concern, so they're not going to plant elm. At the same time, we see these correlations with populations. So emerald ash borer is going to have more of an impact on the Filipino population in Winnipeg based on their distribution as a group through the city of Winnipeg. And that's largely because of the history of the city. And the garment industry was based in the north end, and that's where we saw that immigrant population move after the wave of immigration from the Philippines. And so as a consequence, that's why you're seeing the correlation. But if we present correlation alone, it makes it seem like the urban foresters, had some planning or ulterior motive when, in this case, it was because of immigration patterns and urban policy and land use reform. And so that's why we see those correlations popping up, is the immigration waves and the change in a city over time. So the hope, naturally, over the course of a city is to manage its urban forest well, and to understand where the equalities and inequalities exist. And you can do that with correlation or with the Lorenz curves, but you need the full story, which comes from urban policy and land use planning. The history of a city, where are the difficult areas to plant, and how has it been influenced by the patterns of movement, but also the patterns of building and design over time. And so with that, as you kind of look to the future in Manitoba, we're looking at an area that's difficult to plant, that really comes down to re-engineering and changing in land use policy and landscape planning to facilitate the more diverse species, rather than just plopping new trees in the ground in an area where they won't survive more than 4 or 5 years. So with that, thank you. Happy to answer questions in the chat, and you can send me an email. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lara for her presentation.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Alex, for that great story about urban forest history. I'm going to be giving an example now of urban forest history from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is my hometown. And I'm going to mostly be talking about the London plane tree. For some context to set things up, Philly is a city currently of about 1.6 million people. It's located in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. This whole region was mostly naturally forested prior to colonization. And I'm going to zoom ahead into the early 1900s to talk about when Philly was really in its heyday of street tree planting and also park creation. So this is when Philadelphia and many other cities in New England and the mid-Atlantic parts of the United States were heavily industrialized and were in some ways counteracting that industrial pollution, overcrowding through tree planting to reap different health and thermal comfort benefits. And so, as Alex alluded to, a lot of these early tree plantings in Canadian cities and American cities were monocultures. And I have the benefit of these fantastic annual reports from the city parks department at that time. So in the 1930s, there were every year these records showing what trees were planted, how many, and by who. And so in the 1930s, the most commonly planted genus was Platanus, and those were all London plane trees. There were also quite a lot of maples, mostly Norway maples. By the 1950s, the number of planes planted had dropped dramatically, and the amount of Norway maples planted shot way up. If we then look at planting records in the early 2000s, and these come from a nonprofit partner that does extensive street tree planting these days in Philadelphia, we see that things have changed quite a lot. We now have 131 distinct species, and we don't have anywhere near the same dominance of any one genus or species. We still have quite a lot of maples planted, but no more Norway maples because they are deemed invasive. And we have the rise of smaller flowering trees, such as cherries, crabapples, and serviceberries. And this graph here shows a breakdown by the size class at maturity of all these different plantings. And in the 1930s and 50s, nearly all of the trees that were planted were going to be large if they survived once they reached maturity. So these are our large planes, maples, oaks, and so forth. And in the 2000s, this has completely changed. We now have the dominance of our small and medium stature species. So what's happening here? Well, part of it is the shift from monocultures to more diverse plantings because of the ways that street tree populations were decimated in the past by things like Dutch elm disease. However, there's also this shift away from large shade trees towards smaller, more diverse plantings. And in a lot of cases, that's because modern siting constraints regarding infrastructure conflicts would not allow some of those same large shade trees to be planted. And this is the kind of right tree, right place language that doesn't just relate to infrastructure conflicts, but is often used in the utility sector to talk about the need to plant smaller stature trees. So now I'm going to start talking about the plane tree because this was the dominant monoculture large shade tree in Philadelphia. Unlike other cities that went more all in on elm, Philly went all in on plane trees. And so this is an image of plane trees that are quite old, lining the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia. Then we have some trees in Northeast Philly, including one that got knocked over in a storm. And then we also see quite a few of the planes in park settings in Philadelphia, some in lawn, some in more patio hardscape settings. One of my favorite places in the city, the Rodin Museum, which is along the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which is itself modeled after the Champs-Élysées in Paris, also has a whole bunch of plane trees. And this ends up becoming important because of the way in which people planning the city's vast street tree plantings at that time were really looking to Paris for inspiration. So it's important in talking about the plane tree's story to actually get into, well, what is this tree? Because there was a lot of confusion in those days about what species was even being planted. The London plane is a cross between the American sycamore, Platanus occidentalis, and the Oriental plane, Platanus orientalis. And the accidental hybridization occurred roughly in the 1600s. Botanists have argued over the years about where exactly it occurred, and that relates to what name it's given. My understanding is that the botanists currently are saying that Platanus x hispanica is the name to use, that the hybridization first occurred in Spain, but Platanus x acerifolia is still widely used in practice. These other names also do come up quite a bit. And so a critical piece of this story is actually that the hybrid London plane tree was sold and mistakenly labeled as the Oriental plane in the early 1900s, even though the literature from botany started identifying this as a hybrid in the early 1900s. It didn't really permeate into urban forestry and arboriculture practice until way late in the 1900s. And so the nursery records, the books and catalogs and so forth all talk about the Oriental plane. And this ends up being very important because the Oriental plane entries in books by foresters and by arborists and in nursery catalogs would talk at length about Greek and Persian history, about ancient kings planting this tree. There was also many references to Paris and to the wonderfully maintained street trees there. I also want to give a shout out to this book, The Politics of Street Trees, in which a co-author and I outlined the story of the plains in Philadelphia. And there's a lot of other great stories about how politics and culture and so forth shape street tree systems. So another desirable quality of the London plane tree, or when it was mistakenly called Oriental plane, is that it gets tall and it's fast growing. And these were things that were deemed really critical in the late 1800s, early 1900s, this heyday of the kind of first giant wave of street tree plantings in American cities, because we didn't have air conditioning yet. And because, again, thermal comfort was deemed one of the primary reasons for doing these plantings. Also, the plane tree had then and still has today this reputation for being a tough species, something that can tolerate urban stresses, including poorly drained soils and air pollution. Now, those several characteristics relating to being tall, fast growing, tolerating stresses, those could also be ascribed to the American elm. But where things start differing is that the plane had a reputation of being inexpensive to purchase and especially low maintenance. So even before the elm had the problem of Dutch elm disease, there was an elm leaf beetle that was known to cause municipal foresters to have to do quite a lot of treatment to deal with this beetle. Whereas the plane tree had this reputation of almost being a super tree that was pest and disease free. Now, that may not be entirely true anymore, or really for many decades, but this was the reputation built up in the literature, in the nursery industry, and by other kinds of allied tree professionals. So I'm going to read to you a quote that actually is all the way back from 1842 from an English botanist who was updating a French forester's book about North American trees. And crucially, these various leading botanists and foresters from Europe were well connected in Philadelphia. Philly at that time was the leading center in all of North America for horticulture and the study of plants. So this quote says, "The Oriental plane deserves to be planted in the United States. It makes a noble shade tree in front of the houses where it has room to develop itself. It is beginning to be considerably planted as a shade tree on the sidewalks of streets of several large towns in the United States, and being seldom attacked by insects, rarely elevating pavements. It is exceedingly well calculated for this useful purpose in a climate subject to such ardent heats. And that same kind of language continued as other writers were talking specifically about street tree plantings in the region. So this next quote comes from a small town in New Jersey. The Oriental Plane combines to a greater degree than any other tree the characteristics of rapid growth with everything that is desirable in shade trees. The Oriental Plane makes such an admirable street tree that there is a temptation to plant it to the exclusion of other trees. In the last few years, it has been extensively used in the cities of Washington and Philadelphia, in greater numbers, in fact, than any other single species of tree. Of the 86,000 trees in Paris, over 26,000 are Oriental Planes. And so here we see several of the themes I've already mentioned, including the near synonymous use of shade tree and street tree at that time, and also the repeated mention of Paris. And here are some of the nursery catalog entries. Andorra Nurseries actually claims to have even introduced the Oriental Plane to the United States, a claim that I find dubious at best, but it goes to show their marketing instincts to really claim a stake over having introduced this now very popular tree. And the image shows a river embankment in London. And then from another nursery catalog in 1920, it really stressed that this tree was not bothered by insect pests. This nursery catalog from the Philadelphia suburbs is really critical for the next point that I want to make. It mentions that these trees were planted to improve property values, kind of implying that they would be of interest to the real estate trade. And so this brings me to whose decision really was it to plant these trees in Philadelphia and potentially to plant the street trees in a great many other cities in the US and Canada around this time. Literature today seems to treat street trees as being under the purview of municipal arborists, and formally there can be the understanding that roadside right-of-way trees are under municipal jurisdiction. However, that's not necessarily who's actually making decisions about what to plant currently and in the past. There's a huge influence of botanists, foresters, and landscape architects in development and redevelopment projects and in kind of setting the tone for what species are deemed acceptable. There's another huge role of the nursery trade in terms of what species are available to purchase, particularly in large numbers, and also what kind of marketing messaging is coming out of the nursery industry. But then a piece of the puzzle that I think is really underappreciated is real estate developers. And going back to those planting records I showed from the 1930s, it did not say who exactly got each and every planting permit, but it explained which portion of trees were planted by the city versus which ones were planted by owner. And so in the 1930s, 3/4 of the plains were planted by owner with permit. The 1930s was also the height of the Great Depression. Average Philadelphia citizens were not paying for these permits, but there was a real estate boom, even at the height of the Depression, in some of the expanding neighborhoods kind of just past Philadelphia's center city and historic core. So this is in the lower northeast part of Philadelphia, an area that was developed in the 1930s. And these houses were marketed as being kind of pseudo-suburban in style, so they're not the same tightly packed row houses with really no lawn that a lot of the much older neighborhoods of Philadelphia have. Rather, these are attached twins. They have a bit of front lawn, so a little more spacious, at least by Philadelphia norms. And so today, here is a block of Glenview Street that shows all of these old London planes that are just sort of by casual observation, roughly the same age as the houses. And through a lot of digging, I found actual photographic evidence of some of those trees going in back when the houses were first built. You can sort of just barely make out in that photo from a newspaper story about new housing, the silhouette of the tree. And so moving forward, the London plane has really dropped in its popularity. It's widely infected with anthracnose today, which can be problematic, but is usually not fatal. Then there also is the canker stain, which is native to the US, was actually first reported in Pennsylvania in the 1930s. So although it naturally exists in our forested ecosystems, it doesn't usually spread on its own quite so easily. It spreads through pruning equipment. And so arborists did figure out by the 1950s that if you carefully clean and sterilize your pruning equipment, you will avoid spreading this disease. And canker stain is actually now threatening the native Oriental plains over in Europe. So even though a lot of our plains have endured today, this history of canker stain really led to a sort of informal moratorium, at least in Philadelphia, on continuing to plant these trees. Some have continued to be planted in the decades since, but nowhere near their original numbers. So in the 1940s, the Fairmount Park Commission, which was then the Parks Department responsible for city trees, they reported over 7,000 trees dying from canker stain. And the commission ceased to report supporting plane trees. There were, however, instances, and this gets back to the tension over whose decision is really going on here with species selection. There were instances in the 1970s where developers and landscape architects were planting plane trees, even though the city staff did not want them to. And then despite this kind of challenging history of canker stain and some resistance to plantings, there seems to be this kind of continued praise in horticultural magazines, popular press, in the nursery industry of the plane tree being kind of the super tree that has no pest and disease problems, even though canker stain continues to be a challenge. So as I mentioned previously, there are some plane trees planted today. Here are some images of those planted in the downtown core of Philadelphia, just nowhere near their original numbers. A lot of plane trees are in locations in residential communities where they would no longer be approved. So to kind of summarize my take-home messages, first, species selection is influenced by a great many factors. We have horticultural suitability, cultural symbolism, easy maintenance, inexpensive, and also that many, many stakeholders are shaping street tree composition and diversity. It's far more than just the municipal arborists, and there's a really underappreciated role for housing developers. And also that we have this massive shift underway. Today's plantings are more diverse and smaller stature, and this does have ramifications for the ecosystem services. So we'll have potentially more beauty in a certain way from the smaller stature trees, which may have some important psychosocial benefits, but we're going to be losing some of the shade and other benefits that you can really best achieve through tall species. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the many folks who helped make this research possible. There was a lot of digging into archival resources. And here's my contact information if anyone wants to be in touch. Thank you.
Trees in every country. Trees, you know we can work together and learn what we need to meet the challenge